So today's talk is called Context Rot, how increasing input tokens impacts LLM performance. Generally, if you look online, and I've made this joke as well, the idea is that maybe long context kills retrieval. But that generally isn't the case, right? With thinking models, with a lot of these longer context models, just because you can use more data doesn't mean the results are higher quality, right? An example, if you think of like Jevons paradox, it's like every year our iPhones get bigger and bigger in terms of the battery size. But we just write worse applications and the battery life is just the same. So it's not necessarily the case that things are going to be more efficient as we have more context. And so today I'm really excited to invite Kelly Hong, who is a researcher at a company called Chroma. Chroma is a vector database tool, and I think more and more has been producing a lot of really good technical reports, I think many of which Kelly has created, the generative evals one, this one, I think more to come soon. And so I'm really excited to have her share a little bit more about what they've learned about context rot. As for questions, please add questions to the Slido link. You'll see that in the Zoom chat. And then what we'll do is maybe after this talk, we'll go over some of the more popular upvoted questions, and then we'll go into some live questions. And so with that, Kelly, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for the intro. So as Jason mentioned, Context Rot is a report that we published just a few months ago, but we basically demonstrated that models have non-uniform performance across input lengths. So you can think about like a long context model, like for example, Gemini 2.5 Pro, which has a 1 million token context window. You can give it the same task at 1,000 tokens or 1 million tokens, but you can't guarantee that the model will have reliable performance across all input lengths. And so we call this phenomena context rot, and we kind of like talk about this term, but I don't think it's necessarily like a new phenomena. I think it's something that a lot of people have probably experienced before, just in their own like personal use. Like if you've ever used like Claude Code and you have a long running coding session, or if you're just having like a long conversation in ChatGPT, you might start to notice that at a certain point you start to get like lower quality outputs, and your model just doesn't perform as well as it used to earlier on. So I think our core motivation for this research was to kind of quantify a lot of these like qualitative observations that people have had, and kind of get people to think about these models differently. And I'll first go over the current state of long context models today. So if you look at a lot of these frontier model releases like Gemini, Claude Sonnet 4, and GPT, they always highlight this 1 million token context window. And if you look at Llama 4 as well, they talk about a 10 million token context window, which is a lot. And typically how this is presented is that they kind of imply that these models are able to maintain reliable performance across all input lengths. So up to like all like the 1 million, 10 million token context window. And if we assume this to be true, then obviously if you give the model more context, then it'll only be beneficial for you. It's going to have more informed outputs just because you're giving it more information, and the model works just as well. And I think when Claude Sonnet 4 came out with their 1 million token context window, they kind of highlight this benefit. You're able to do the same tasks across larger code bases. You're able to process, hundreds of documents at a time, and, maintain like that full context and just keep getting like higher quality outputs. And a common benchmark that is often kind of used to like validate this performance across long context is that is like this benchmark that a lot of people use, which is called needle in a haystack. And I'll talk a bit more about this in the next slide. But I think just by looking at this visual, you can already start to understand like, okay, you have some kind of task at 10,000 input tokens. And then you also have the same task at 1 million input tokens. And you can see that the model succeeds on all of these tasks. So I think like from how companies like present long context in these models, it's pretty easy to like extrapolate from this and just think that, okay, I can get reliable performance regardless of any like input length I give my model. But I want to talk a bit more about what needle in a haystack is and why it might not be as representative of the tasks that you would actually give these models in practice. So needle in a haystack is a very simple retrieval task where you basically give a random fact, we call that the needle, and you place that within a long context window, which we call the haystack. And you simply ask the model to retrieve that fact. And I'll go over one of the examples that we use for experiments where we have a question that's asking about writing advice. So it's like, what was the best writing advice I got from my college classmates? And then our corresponding needle or answer to that question would be the best writing advice I got from my college classmate was to write every week. And this is just placed in a haystack of program essays. Nothing to do with writing advice, but just for the purposes of filling the context. And if you look closely at the question and the needle, you can see that there's a lot of lexical overlap, meaning that you can literally just match the question and the needle just by matching the text. It doesn't require any like deeper semantic processing. And I think this actually simplifies the retrieval task by a lot. And it's not very representative of how people use long context in practice because you're going to have tasks that are a lot more complicated and semantically oriented. And by semantically oriented, I mean that you're gonna, be putting like tasks into your model, which require, more, I guess, like require the model to infer like semantic associations beyond just these simple lexical matches. So that was the first experiment that we did. We basically added ambiguity to our question in Needle. So we can have the same question, like what was the best writing advice I got from my college classmate? Same lexical matching in Needle. But then we added a needle that requires semantic matching. So it also answers the question, but it requires the model to maybe like infer some more like semantic associations between the question and the needle. So the semantic matching needle in this case is I had an interesting friend who I took some humanities courses with back in college. He would write every single day, and he told me to try writing at least once a week. Looking back, I think it's the most useful habit I've developed for my writing. And in this case, you basically have to make the connection between like best writing advice and the most useful habit I've developed for my writing, and also like college classmate and friend who I took some courses with back in college. So this is a pretty simple task too. Like I think like all the model has to do is just like make these simple semantic associations, but you can see that it actually causes performance to drop quite significantly when we compare that to the lexical matching task. So semantic matching in this case is represented by the red line, and then lexical matching is represented by the blue line here. And I'll kind of go over how you can understand these visualizations. But basically, we did this experiment across a lot of models, and we grouped them by their context window and their general like performance. So for example, if you have a long context model over 500K tokens and a high performing one, that would be something like GPT 4.1. But then if you have a small context window model that performs pretty poorly, that would be something like GPT like 3.5. So we group these models, but across like all these groups, you can see that when we have like the semantic matching task, that causes performance to degrade a lot faster as context length increases. And this has some pretty important implications for anyone, building applications with these models, and they're facing or they're like using a lot of these like long context tasks, because it's more common that you'll be working with ambiguous queries that, demand more processing beyond, if you just have simple lexical matches. And I think we can take this example here if you're working with some financial reports. So you're working with like hundreds of pages of financial documents, and somewhere within that document, you have the snippet that says Germany contributed $45 million, Japan contributed $38 million, and the United Kingdom contributed $32 million. Combined international markets total 67% of revenue in fiscal 2024, up from 43% in fiscal 2023. And if you had a lexical matching query, you might have a question like, how much did Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom contribute to revenue in fiscal 2024? You can see that we can like easily match like Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom and revenue in fiscal 2024 because these are just simple keyword matches. But I think a more realistic query in this case is just asking the model, okay, how is our overseas expansion going? And then the model would kind of have to like make this association that overseas means, these countries, and like connect that to international markets. Because if you're working with so much information, it's very unlikely that you're going to know these specific keywords ahead of time. You kind of want the model to like pull in that information for you too. But we demonstrate, we demonstrate here that if you have these tasks that require some additional semantic processing, these models aren't very reliable as you have longer inputs. So just something important to keep in mind that even if this task seems very straightforward, you're not necessarily like guaranteed to get reliable performance if you're working with such long inputs. We did another experiment where we added distractors as well. And I'll first go over how we define distractors in this context. So we take the same example with the question and needle pair about writing advice. And we can break the haystack down into two types of content. The first is just considered to be irrelevant content. So this is just a snippet from a program essay talking about addiction. It has nothing to do with writing advice. But then as you go on, we have this distractor also talking about writing advice. But this one is talking about writing advice from a college professor. So it's it's a fact that's kind of similar to the needle. So, it might surface when you're asking that kind of question, but if you actually understand what a distractor is, you'll know that it doesn't quite answer the question. And so we came up with around like 4 distractors for this question. This one talks about, college professor instead of college classmate. This one's the worst writing advice, and this one's talking about high school classmate and etc. And so we test this like across 3 different conditions. The first is where you just have the needle and no distractors. Second is where you just have the needle and 1 distractor. And then the third is where you just have the needle and 4 distractors. And we represent each of these conditions as like one color on this graph. So the blue line represents the condition where we have no distractors. So it's just a needle. The yellow line represents the condition where we have 1 distractor, and the red line is where we have all 4 distractors. And I think you can pretty easily see here that as you have more distractors in your context, which basically means, as you have more similar information in your context, that degrades model performance, and that effect is amplified as you have increasing input length. And this appears a lot, I think, in real use cases, because especially if you're working in domain-specific applications, it's very common for you to have like similar information in your context. And I'll take the example of the financial report analysis again, where you might have a question that's asking something like, okay, how much did Germany contribute to revenue in fiscal 2024? And then you have an answer that says Germany contributed $45 million in fiscal 2024. And then you might have these following distractors. Germany contributed 35 million, but in fiscal 2023, or France contributed 38 million. Because I think financial documents are a good example for this, because it's very common that you're going to have sentences that look almost exactly the same. Maybe the only difference is like a name or numbers that appear. And I think for a lot of like other domain specific like applications as well, you're going to have just like information that looks very similar to each other. And that can be distracting for your model. And it has to perform that additional processing of like disambiguating between the exact answer you're looking for and like any other similar distractors. We did some more analysis on the failed attempts in the 4 distractor condition. So it's basically this condition here where we have the needle and 4 distractors in the haystack. So we looked at like all the attempts where the model did not answer the question correctly, and the responses often fall into, they always fall into like 1 or 2 categories. It either abstains from answering, basically saying that it doesn't know the answer, or it answers with a distractor, just saying or claiming a wrong answer because it got distracted by one of the distractors that it saw. And we noticed some pretty interesting behaviors within or like across like model families. So for Claude models, we saw that these models have a tendency to abstain the most. So whenever it's not confident about an answer, it'd rather say that it just doesn't know the answer rather than hallucinating a wrong answer. Whereas we saw the opposite for GPT models. They had the lowest rates of abstaining, and it would tend to just like confidently claim the wrong answer. And yeah, we saw some interesting behavior with like Gemini and Clem models as well. But I think we can look at these results and kind of see that, as you have longer inputs, your models aren't always going to like answer reliably, even if you give it all the right information and context. Because in all these cases, the model did have the correct needle in context. It was just had to deal with these additional distractors too. So just something important to keep in mind, especially if you're working in like applications where you might have very similar, maybe like conflicting information in your context. And yeah, I'll talk about another experiment we did as well. This is where we kind of manipulated the structure of the haystack. And this isn't directly applicable to a real use case, but I think we got some interesting observations for this, which might be a bit counterintuitive to how people typically think about these models. So we can take the original task, which basically contains coherent essays. So it's literally just like polygram essays appended one after another. And if you place a random needle within this haystack, it would disrupt the logical flow of ideas. So it's just an essay talking about addiction, and then suddenly you have a needle talking about writing advice. So if you're kind of looking at this from, I guess, like the structural perspective, like a needle stands out because it's just like suddenly disrupting this essay talking about addiction. Whereas if you have a more shuffled haystack, say you have one sentence talking about addiction, another talking about founders, and then philosophy, and then writing advice, the needle blends in more with respect to the logical structure. So if you kind of think about this in a way that a human might process this kind of information, you might think that, okay, like a needle that like stands out would probably be easier to spot compared to a needle that just like blends in with a bunch of like other randomly shuffled sentences. And this kind of follows the assumption that models will process context in a kind of like structured, like order sensitive manner. But what we actually saw was the opposite behavior. So models actually performed better when the haystack was randomly shuffled. Now, we don't really know why this happens, unfortunately, because I think that would require more additional research into interpretability. But I think it just kind of goes to show that we can't assume certain behaviors about how models, process information, even if it logically makes sense to us. And so we did a few more experiments as well. I won't go into too much detail on these because I think that would make the presentation too long, but you can check it out in the full report if you want. And yeah, one of the experiments that we did was on conversational memory. So for this one, we use a benchmark called long mem eval, which is basically like the task is you give the model a long conversation thread. So just like a conversation that you would have in ChatGPT. And then at the end of that task or at the end of that conversation, you would ask the model a question that refers to like specific parts of the conversation that you fed in. So we tested this across like two different conditions. So the first condition is the focus condition, which is the red bar here. And that's basically the situation where you give the model only the relevant information. So you just only give it the parts that are like relevant to answering the question. And this was typically around like 300 tokens, I think. And then you give it the full context as well. So you basically just fill the rest of the context with other chats that are unrelated to the core task. So this, I think, ranged around like 120K tokens. And it's essentially the same task. The only difference is that there is more irrelevant content like feed it in just to extend the input length of the task. And you can see that the models perform significantly better on the focus version. So only one is given like just the right information without any other irrelevant context. But when you give it the full context, the models perform a lot worse. So I think this might be representative of if you're working with some kind of like conversational chatbot and you just have a long running conversation, even on like very simple tasks that require retrieving like a few messages from like the conversation you have so far and doing simple reasoning over it. Even like Claude Opus 4 might do bad on those kinds of tasks. And we did another synthetic task on text replication. So the input to the model will be something like simply replicate the following text and output the exact same text. And then we just give it a series of repeated words and one modified word within that series of words. And I think this task was pretty interesting because we saw that even for like frontier models, it would degrade in performance pretty significantly. And we saw some other like interesting behaviors as well. Like for example, for the Claude models, sometimes they would just refuse to give any kind of output because when it was like dealing with a long input, it would think that it was generating copyrighted material. So it would just refuse to like answer. And with the Gemini models, we just saw like completely random outputs that are like unrelated to like the word that we gave it or like task. It would just start outputting random words. And although this task isn't very representative of like how you might use these models in practice, I think it just kind of goes to show that like even with these very simple tasks, these models are pretty unreliable as you increase in input length. And so I think the main takeaways that you can have from this is that, obviously models have non-uniform performance across input lengths, even for the like very simple tasks like just simple retrieval or like conversational question answering. And in all of these tasks, we give the model like all the right information in the context. Maybe like the rest of the context is filled with like irrelevant information, but we obviously saw a lot of variation in performance. So that kind of goes to show that like how you present the context matters a lot. And that leads to my last point, that context engineering is critical. Basically, context engineering refers to like how you manage the context that you give to your model. And I think this is like becoming a very popular topic right now. So I'll talk about one example of what this might look like. And context engineering is very dependent on your use case. There is no like one solution that would work for everyone, but I'll just kind of go through this common example of what I've seen or like how I've seen people manage their context, just so you can kind of get an idea of what this might look like. And I know Jason wrote a bit about this too recently, but basically the use case here is that you can have a coding agent that's performing some kind of like long running task. So maybe you're working with like Claude Code to perform some like complicated task. And a naive approach to manage the context, or you're not really managing context at all, would just be like appending the conversation history with every like tool call or like turn you have. And especially if you think about like tool calls like file reads, obviously that's going to fill up your context like very, very fast. So you might, reach up to like hundreds of thousands of tokens. And a better approach that would kind of help target this would be to break the task down into subtasks. So maybe you can ask like a main like orchestrator agent to create a plan of subtasks. So like to complete this complicated tasks, like what are the tasks that I need to do in order? And then using that, the orchestrator agent can spawn sub-agents. So each sub-agent would kind of be managing its own like it would be kind of like in its own thread. So it would perform that task in its own context, and then at the end, only return the most relevant information to the orchestrator agent. So in this way, you have kind of like this main like orchestrator agent thread that is only keeping the most relevant information, and that way it's given the right context and um, it's presented in a way that it doesn't get like distracted or like it doesn't have to deal with like filtering out all the irrelevant information. So yeah, there's a lot of other approaches to context engineering as well. I think there's a lot of resources out there, but yeah, that's just one example that I've seen people use. And yeah, we did a lot more experiments that I didn't cover in this presentation, but if you want to check it out, you can go to research.trychroma.com. We did some other work previously as well on generative benchmarking, but yeah, I think that pretty much covers this presentation. But yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. Happy to answer any questions that people have.
Sweet. All right. For anyone else who is just still here, it's not still, who is curious about asking questions, make sure you just upvote the questions you have on Slido and then also add any questions that you have in mind. Yeah, looking at a couple of these, maybe I can already just go through some of them. One thing that I noticed here is that a lot of the data that you're pulling out is prose, right? How much do you think this changes for things like structured data? So for example, sometimes we represent tables as Markdown, sometimes we represent them as XML or JSON. Do you think Chroma is looking to sort of do some more experimentation on like the representation of these text chunks?
I think that would actually be really interesting to test out. I think at Chroma, we probably won't like extend on like context raw more, but I think one variation that we actually did was we tested this with like two types of haystacks. So like one was on like polygram essays, which I'm demonstrating here, but we also did this on archive papers as well, which might contain like some like tables or more, I guess, like structured
Right.
data. And we did see like variation in performance there. Like the models would like I think often perform worse when it was working with that archive data. So I think information that's more like information dense. I think it's an interesting research direction, but I'm not too sure like how you know I'm not sure like how I would expect the models to perform. But I think yeah, it would be interesting if someone were to test that out.
Yeah, I personally have done some experiments on tables, and basically what I found is like for a very simple
Yeah.
table, Markdown works really, really well. And once you get into very complex
Mm,
tables, then you generally want to switch to XML. But even then,
mm,
I've seen like our ability to like sort of say, you know what, like column 7,200, row 300, what was the value above it or below it, or like, three off the
yeah.
diagonal. We had some evals like that, and generally it's like, yeah, if you have 10,000 rows and like 200 columns, you still tend to do
Mm,
quite well. Um,
interesting.
Luisa asks, are there any explanations or hypotheses as to why this behavior happens? Um, what is important to understand when we think about these new models?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't really know why this happens. I think this is very common in just like a lot of weird LLM behaviors. I think that requires a lot of like deeper research into like, actually getting into like how these models work internally. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. But generally, I think how you should think about these models is that you can't always expect it to like perform in a way that like a human would like process information. And I think we saw this a bit with like when we shuffled the Haystack content. Like you kind of expect the model to maybe like process content in a way that's like order sensitive, maybe just like read the essays like logically and then notice like when something like stands out or like doesn't belong. But we saw that these models like do better on the shuffle context, which is kind of like counterintuitive of like how you might think these models like process information. And I think like the general theme with like long context too, like if you give a human like the same task with like in like a very short, like condensed form, versus the same task with the same level of difficulty, but with like, maybe just like a bunch of more like irrelevant information. That might take a longer time, but you would still expect the person to perform, just as well, just as reliably. But you can't really expect the same behavior from these models. So I think, yeah, maybe just an important takeaway is just to, be cautious about like what you assume about these models. But yeah, I unfortunately don't have an answer as to why this happens.
I think there are some analogies or some things we can reason about in terms of the actual like attention mechanism here,
Mm,
right? So, for example, you might expect lexical match to be better than semantic match because, okay, well, if I'm looking for these four words in the same order, tokens one, two, three, four in order will probably attend better to the literally the same tokens one, two, three, four in the text. And so there might be some idea of like, okay, we can attend to the same tokens. The attention might be. I also know that for some models, I don't really know what the details are of these like closed source models, but there are models where the attention is kind of like a sliding window. And so if you're looking for one thing in a sliding window, it's actually really easy because imagine me reading a book. I just have to check one page and whether or not the fact is there. But if I have multiple facts or multiple distractors, then I have to sort of keep track of the page numbers, and then that's a
yeah.
more difficult task. Um, and so I can imagine different attention mechanisms might have different performance on these kinds of tasks.
Mhm.
But yeah, generally for the closed source stuff, you can't really tell. I do know uh, Claude can tell if it's being evaluated for needle and haystack.
Really?
Yeah, so
Can you say more?
Anthropic had a bunch of interpretability stuff, and basically when they were doing needle in the haystack experiments in the chain of thought, it would say,
Mhm.
"I think I'm being tested right now. Let me pay extra attention to."
Really?
And
Wait,
it was for like
that's really
it was for an
interesting.
example where like data was put into like the Great Gatsby, and I was
Mm,
like, "I think I'm being tested right now on needle in the haystack. Let me pay attention. Let me pay closer attention to what's going on."
interesting,
Oh,
interesting.
that stuff was weird, really weird to discover. Um, I guess okay. This is a question I'm curious about on your end as well, which is
Mhm.
if your knowledge base is less than 200,000 tokens, can you just shove it in the entire prompt and let that run?
I think it depends on your use case, but I mean, I think generally what we saw for these models, like we tested like the Claude models when they were like the 200K like
Yeah.
context window. But like even for those, we saw like pretty significant like performance degradation. Like I think, um, like for this one here, the input length, obviously like wasn't up to like 200K, but we still see like pretty significant degradation. So I think like even if it's below 200K, I don't think you can expect reliable performance. And I expect like if you're working with like one like set knowledge base, I would also have a lot of distractors in it as well. Like it's probably containing like very similar information. It's not just like completely irrelevant information and then you just have like one snippet that's like relevant to your task. So I think that's kind of representative of the experiment that we did with distractors. I think, yeah, ideally you would want to have more, I guess, like condensed context. Like even if you can fit your entire knowledge base, I would still do some like additional processing to make sure that your model is only getting the most relevant information to work with.
Yeah, I think it also just goes back down to this idea of, you will get some performance for some latency and some cost trade-off. Right? Like
Yeah.
maybe with prompt caching, it's worth it because you're gonna just save having to like write more code. I think like the original version of projects had all the things shoved in the context, and it was probably good for some use cases, but not for others. And now projects use RAG, and it's like I can see it underperforming in many cases. Or have to tell, like, please read the other articles and write something similar rather than just sort of putting it in.
Mm.
But yeah, I guess this is something I'm also curious about, which is now that GPT-5 is out, do you think you're gonna rerun these evals against your existing evals? Like, is there
I'd
like
like to
a
see.
ChromaDB leaderboard that?
Yeah, I think we haven't done that yet, but I think we might do that soon. I mean, we have like all the experiments set up, so yeah, we can just run it. But I think something interesting with GPT-5 though was that I think they came out with a much smaller context window. I think it was around like
Mm.
100 something K tokens, whereas like GPT 4.1 was 1 million tokens. Um, I think their main reasoning for that was that like people, like they didn't see like a I guess like a significant use case to like train the models like as well, like up to
Mhm.
that million token context window. So it's a lot smaller and maybe like it performs better like across 100K tokens. So I'd want to see that too. Maybe, yeah, we'll do that soon.
And then what about like the relative positions of the needle and the
Mm,
distractors? So I don't know if I saw something there, but yeah, I'm curious.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
needle and the distractor are close together versus far apart. What would be the like recommendation there?
Mm,
'Cause right now I'm
maybe,
treating it as
yeah.
like I should randomly shuffle.
Yeah, okay, regarding like relative position, we didn't test for that specifically. Like the distractors were all just like randomly positioned in the context.
Mhm.
Um, But I think like a question that a lot of people have is like, okay, like does the position of the needle matter? So like, does the position of like my relevant information like matter in the context when I feed it into the model? And I think like some people have the assumption that if you put it in the beginning or like put it at the end of the context, like maybe the model it tends to it better. We actually didn't see like any like strong evidence for that. Like we tested the needle across like, like all possible like positions throughout the haystack, but we didn't see the model like like favor like the beginning or the end. Like it would kind of like perform the same across all positions. So, maybe that could generalize to like the relative position with disruptors too. Like I honestly don't think position matters as much as people think they do.
That makes sense. Might just be best to randomly shuffle. Yeah, I think it's also just a factor of like the way people have been implementing the attention mechanism. Uh,
Mhm.
it's fascinating. Shufei asks, I don't know if I understand this question, but what would be a simple solution to address context route without using agents? Shu, can you like give a little bit more context as to what you meant? I think I see you in
Yeah,
this.
I guess it's to address the earlier comment that you made. You guys are talking about using agents to mitigate some of
Okay.
the issues here in context route. And I was like, is there a
Yes.
non-agent approach to this?
Mm. Yeah, I think I mean, one method would just be like filtering the context, right? So maybe you can imagine just doing like a single pass of like, okay, here's like this long context feed into LLM, and the only task is like literally just to retrieve like the most like relevant information to pass into the model that's actually like performing the task. You can also just do like typical like vector retrieval as well. You don't necessarily need to like break this down into like sub-agents. I think that makes sense for tasks like coding, but maybe sometimes it's more practical just to do like one like filtering pass. Yeah, maybe Jason, you have some other thoughts on this
Yeah, I
as
mean, I
well.
guess like when you think about context route, it's mostly the worry that many of the tokens are sort of irrelevant or low signal. And so you have to look at the components of what the like messages history looks like. There's going to be messages, there's thinking tokens now, there are tool calls, there are the tool call calls, and then the tool call responses, right? Um, And so subagents say, you know what, I'm going to send it somewhere else, organize it, and then get back a single answer. Again, but we talked about Claude Code earlier, where Claude Code will say, I will only keep the tool call responses of the tools that were called after the last 3 user messages. So you like 3 is like a hyperparameter. And so like if I've been talking to the agent for 20 steps, only the tool calls of the last 3 messages are kept. And then all the like edit file, edited lines 1 to 30 and deleted lines 12 to 17, like those are now like out of the context, because that might be confusing, right? Because maybe showing you code that was deleted and also code that was added too often is going to be confusing, and maybe you would rather have the coding agent just say, let me read the file again, right? But in the same sense, like you don't want like 7 versions of the file read, editing it 10 times, and then now like maybe the model thinks it knows what the file looks like. But if you just delete all that, reread the file, you might have higher quality context. So I think a lot of that is going to be around like pruning the tool calls and also potentially pruning the reasoning tokens. And maybe after you spend 1,000 tokens thinking about what tool call to use, do you throw it out or do you keep it? It was really unsure, right? Maybe the thinking was like incorrect and now it's in your messages array, and now this incorrect thinking is going to propagate over time. But maybe you can hedge against that. Those are some general ideas, but I think you really need evals to really understand what's worth it and what's not worth it. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think the loss in the middle question was kind of addressed. Let me just take a look at some of these questions over here. Oh, this is interesting. What context engineering does the Chroma as the product actually allow us to do?
Oh, so yeah, so Chroma is a vector database company. Vector databases basically allow you to do like semantic retrieval, and I think maybe like a very basic use case is like if you're working with some like large like knowledge base, you could like chunk that knowledge base and you would like embed that into your vector database, and this basically allows you to do like semantic search over it. So I guess like one like comparison would be like passing in that entire knowledge base into your LLM and just like expecting it to like do well on a task. But then if you use Chroma, you could like maybe like give your agent or like whatever like model you're using like a tool to call that knowledge base and like only retrieve maybe like the top 5 relevant chunks from that knowledge base. Then that's just like a very simple method to like condense like all of that context into like the most like short like condensed form. And there's a lot you can do here too. You can add in like re-ranking. You can like add in just some like additional like retrieval components to it as well. But I think like at the core, Chroma just allows you to like I guess like organize your knowledge base in that way, so you can do like easy retrieval over them. And we also support like sparse vector search as well, like full text search, just allowing I guess like your agents to do like search of your knowledge base, so you don't have to like give it all of that entirely at once.
Yeah, I think recently Chroma also now supports like regular expressions.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
as we've seen, like Claude Code and like Codex are pretty good at writing regular expressions, so that might be another way of thinking about how to do search. I'm noticing a general theme over these questions. One around, I did not write the text. How can I be confident that the documents are actually a high enough quality that I can search against that? And I kind of want to bring attention to an article that Anthropic wrote called Contextual Retrieval. And the idea here is that, once you chunk the data, maybe what you can use is you can use the chunk information around that text chunk to rewrite the context, rewrite the chunk to be a little bit more informative, right? Imagine a financial context where I have a 1 page and it's split into 2 chunks. And the first chunk, I mentioned the company by name. And in the second chunk, I only mention the company. So the second chunk just says the company's growth has gone 30% month over month in the last quarter. Right? That chunk is kind of useless.
Yeah.
Because it's not specific enough. And the chunk above it says Uber in 2025 has made $2 billion. And so what contextual retrieval can do is it can say, you know what, given the second chunk and some additional information, rewrite it so it's fully qualified. And then you might rewrite the chunk from this company has grown 30% month over month this quarter to Uber's revenue has grown 30% month over month from 2 to 3 in the Q1 of 2025.
Right.
And then you can maybe look at embedding that and doing retrieval over that and reasoning over that. That's generally how I've looked at avoiding some of this, the existential question of just like, I can't control the source text. And in some ways you can't. You can really think about synthetic text chunks as a way of augmenting your existing data, right? If you want to search images, you might actually want to give a visual language model the ability to look at the image, write a summary, and then do search over the summary. But maybe when you answer the question, you can load both the summary and the image back into the context. So there's a lot of things there that you can do to make things a little bit more tractable, right? And again, the way I like to think about this is, I'm going to spend some compute to answer the question. How much of that compute do I want to spend in the beginning when I read the documents in? And how much compute do I want to spend at the end when I use the agent, right? If you look at Claude Code does no semantic indexing. Claude Code just says, I don't want to do anything, but I make money every time that my customer executes any file read. And so I'm just going to charge my customer for every file read. And if I have to read 7 files and run grep 22 times, I'm winning. But maybe you as the provider, if you're a cursor, you're like, man, that's really expensive. Let me think about how we can do RAG and semantic search over code, because that's the only way I can offer a product that's $20 a month, right? Because I have some other margin to take care of. And so it's really around, where do I want to spend my resources? In the reading and writing of the embeddings, or in the reading and writing of the agent? That's generally a way that I find is really helpful in terms of thinking about how to view these things. All right, let's look at some other questions. I guess, Kelly, this is a question I ask everyone, which is, what do you think people are not thinking about as they're, building out their context engineering practice? I'll let you think about that as I scan over some of these questions.
It's a good question. I feel like a mistake that a lot of people make is that they're not fully aware of what's happening at each step of the agentic process. So a lot of people, they just kind of give it some input, and then they only look at the output, and they're just oh, why isn't this working? And they don't really go into the details of okay, what kind of documents did it retrieve? What tool calls did it make? Exactly where did it fail? I think I talked about this a bit in the previous generative benchmarking talk, but it's really important to kind of break down your agentic process, or whatever application you're building, into each step, and literally look at the inputs and outputs of each step to debug where it's going wrong. Because there's a lot of abstractions nowadays. You can just give an agent some input and just see what it did after a bunch of different LLM calls. But I think, yeah, it's really important to kind of take a step back and debug each step of the process to really understand where it went wrong. Because I don't think you can go very far by just working with these abstractions and only looking at the final output. I'm sure you've you've probably seen this a lot as well. But yeah, I think that'll probably be the main thing that I point out.
Mandla mentions something that's pretty interesting, which is that they said, it feels like there's an expensive rabbit hole one might be in the danger of going down, trying to use agents to enrich the context more and more. Is there a systematic way in finding the line where doing so stops being worthwhile? I think this is where most people, again, should really focus on having retrieval evals, right? So in retrieval, I have a search query, I search n documents, and I have a score, like recall or NDCG, that says, was the n documents I wanted to find in the k results that I returned? The fact that it's an agent doesn't really change anything, right? Because what you're saying is, okay, well, in one hop, I find 10 documents, and my recall is 0.2. In 2 hops, I find 10 more documents. So in these 20 documents, my recall is 0.6. I think you can probably build a chart that says, what is my recall and how many steps does my agent need to take to try to find the right data, right? And what you're going to find is probably some kind of curve that flattens out. And maybe you want to just look at what that curve looks like, you know? Because right now, if you look at things like Codex and Cursor, that curve is terrible. It'll like grep 7 times, then it'll like read 4 files, then it'll grep something again, and it reads 4 files. And you're like, wow, this made 19 API calls. Turns out you make 19 API calls, they just make more money, so it's fine for them. But it might not be fine if you're the one providing the agent. But again, it's like, you know, there is going to be this like recall and end hops plot that you can make. And I think realistically, what you might find is, well, instead of using grep and read file, if I use semantic search, maybe the number of hops can decrease, right? But that just means I'm spending more money embedding everything. And now you have a whole set of other problems to worry about. Like if I edit the code, like how quickly do I update the database? There's always going to be some trade-offs that you have to make.
Yeah, I agree. I think like in order to answer that question, you would need to do some kind of like eval, like something where you can just kind of like test the like specific components. Oh, like what if I give an agent like these tools versus like take out one tool, replace it with another? Like how much better does it perform? And yeah, I think it's hard to just like try to like think through a solution without actually like testing out your agent and like seeing these like quantified numbers.
Yeah, exactly. I think some other questions are mostly talking about like long context. One of them was like, how does ChatGPT and Claude deal with chat compaction if you have a long context? And I think the answer is ChatGPT doesn't. It just says that you've run out, and it can ask you to make a new thread.
Yeah.
And for chatbots, it makes sense, but for agents that have to do work, that's a lot more challenging.
Yeah, I think for a lot of agents, like if you're working with like Claude Code, their compaction method right now is like literally just to summarize the conversation. Like if you do like auto compact, it literally just like passes the entire like conversation into like Claude, and then it's like, okay, summarize like what we've done, what we're gonna do next, and you know, like what the user wants to do. But I think a lot of people have realized that these compaction methods aren't very good. I mean, if you've used like Claude Code, like compact yourself, you might have like experienced this, but it loses out on a lot of like relevant information. Like for example, if you're working in like a Claude Code session where you have like code snippets and then you like compact that into like natural language, like you're not really like retaining like information that's like relevant enough to like continue the task as if like the agent you know, had like perfect context of like what you've done previously. So yeah, I think like the current compaction methods are like very naive. It's literally just like summarization, or they don't do any compaction at all, and you just have to start a new session altogether. I think this is still like a pretty big problem that's unresolved, but yeah, important to consider that like compaction usually doesn't like maintain your context as well as you would like it to.
Yeah, it's just like, you know, how much do you get to compress things, right? I think a lot of the questions I'm noticing now, like even the one on Zoom, it's like, what if I did this? What if I did that? Are they like valid strategies? And the answer generally is yes, but there's going to be a lot more assumptions you can make if you know what the actual problem is, right? And I think a lot of this ends up just being like, how quickly can I run these experiments? Do I believe that my evals correlate with the business outcome I'm looking for? And at the cost constraints of how I want to build this product, will I actually like earn a return from my customer, right? It's like I could summarize every single step and use like multiple agents to do some work, but if I sell a $20 a month SaaS, it actually doesn't matter. Like I just can't do it. I have to start doing compaction. I have to start doing semantic search because it's just too costly. I think that's the reality of like actually building things and using things. But generally, you know, if you have an idea, there's a good chance it'll probably work, but you need to test against your own evals. Because these tasks get really strange really quickly. Like the chatbot use case is usually the one that's the least economically valuable, right? Like I probably made tens of thousands of dollars with Claude Code and probably very little money with ChatGPT because ChatGPT is just talking to me. Whereas Claude Code now is like deploying apps and like, you know, doing all this work. And once you know what the work is, you can make a lot of guardrails and make a lot of assumptions on how the work is being done. Right? And
Yeah, I think there's like a ton of variation between like use cases, and like I think I just want to emphasize the point that you really need to just like work with your own data and like do evals on that, because what works for like one use case might not work for another. Like if you're working with these, I don't know, if you're looking at this like coding agent, like context engineering approach where you like break tasks down into subagents, like maybe that doesn't work as well just for like typical like internal like company documents, like 'cause that's probably not as practical. So yeah, I think definitely just like try like testing out your ideas like on your own data, and then just see what works, what doesn't work. Instead of just trying to like, I guess like quickly like adopt these like other strategies and like assuming that it'll work just as well.
Exactly. I think that's all the time we have. I gotta jump off another meeting real quick, but for anyone who's here, we'll send notes and the recordings out as soon as possible. I think the notes might take maybe like the afternoon. And then, as always, Kelly, thank you so much for sharing all this knowledge. I'm really excited to see the next report. Do you know when that's going to come out? Do you have any hints? And
No exact date yet, but within the next few months, maybe like within the next 2 months. We'll
perfect,
see.
awesome.
Yeah.
As always, on behalf of everyone, Kelly, thank you so much. And
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.